Welcome back to the Mission Control Custom YouTube channel. We are going to briefly overview my personal carbine, the VooDoo Queen. And I'm going to briefly explain why it's called the VooDoo Queen. It's called the VooDoo Queen because it's sporting a 16-inch Adams Arms VooDoo barrel with a mid-length gas system, 1 and 7 twist rate. And the other reason I call it the VooDoo Queen is because I completely rebuilt it by hand, and it's voodoo magic that it works as well as it does. Not only works as well as it does, but works way better in its factory configuration as I bought it as. So let's get right to it. I already explained the barrel. I highly suggest anything with a mid-length barrel. As you can see, it's free-floated, but I didn't have it free-floated because of its contribution to accuracy. I actually had free-floated because I have really long arms, and I really like to have that extra stretch to grab at. Next, I am actually going to explain the internals. So we are going to go ahead and unload it. As you can see, it's on safe. Sling that round out of there. So, as most of you can see, I'm sporting a lot of ambidextrous controls, meaning that I can manipulate a lot of the systems from both hands, which is good even if you have one hand that's more dominant than the other. You see there I have the ambidextrous safety. I have a bad lever by Magpul. I don't have an ambidextrous magazine release just because I don't trust most of them that exist. But speaking of trustworthiness, those are KNS non-rotational pins. I believe they're referred to as two different things, but I like to think of them as non-rotational pins. They're an added benefit that they won't allow your trigger and hammer pins to walk out, which doesn't happen that often, but for me it's kind of a peace of mind thing. Oh, by the way, I'm sporting a old school forward assist there. I really like that. It's cool. It's more aesthetic than anything, honestly. So before I move away from the internals and controls, I want to point out the trigger system. And yes, that's the biggest B5 or Bravo company charging. Sorry, I didn't mean B5. That's the biggest Bravo company charging handle. I like big controls for gross movement. So let's get inside here. And you may or may not noticed those are JP low pressure competition springs. Those pop off at about 3.5 pounds. And in order to make that work inside a standardized trigger system, you actually have to bob your hammer. As you can see that if a freaking camera will focus here, that hammer has actually been bobbed. I cut the ass end off of it with a Dremel. That's because it won't ignite harder primers unless you do that. Or you could buy a $65 hammer, which I wasn't going to do. Furthermore, I have actually polished the points where the hammer and trigger interact with each other, which means the trigger pops off with a lot less resistance and a lot more crispness. And even furthermore, this hole that attaches this pistol grip has been bored out or tapped out a little extra longer and then rethreaded to the same specification. And now a screw interacts with the floor of the trigger system, so instead of it having to travel all the way from here to here before it starts moving away from the hammer here, that floor space is taken up. So immediately when we start pulling on the trigger, it's pulling it away from the hammer rather than pulling its butt off the floor before it can pull away from the hammer. So a lot of people frown against this kind of thing in a weapon system that you plan on staking your life on, but I think whatever rifle you have is just whatever one you should use to keep your ass alive. Speaking about keeping your ass alive, inside this pistol grip here, I actually have all the guts to a bolt. So if the firing pin, retaining pin, even the springs, I have it all in here. It's all a Bushmaster small parts kit minus pivot pins and what have you. It's just basically everything I would need to rebuild the bolt if anything blew up on a bolt. So next I'll go ahead and point out all the other Magpul features. You can see I put on this trigger guard. That's mostly because it's hard to interact with this with standard trigger guard. Another thing, I have an ASAP. I really like it. It makes collapsing the stock all the way in kind of a pain in the butt. These are awesome stocks. I just have the one in the wrong spec. This is what's referred to as civilian spec, so it's actually got more tolerance around the tube, which means it wiggles more than it really should. So, but that's going to get remedied soon. I have a vertical foregrip. I had an angled foregrip. I just find this more utilitarian. Let's see, Magpul, 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 Magpul. Of course, I use Magpul magazines. That's all the stuff that's really worth pointing out. I'm using a Vortex red dot, and it is pretty kick-ass, guys. If you need a pretty good red dot at a pretty good price, I would highly suggest this one. I'm actually probably going to throw something in the way of 4-power glass on this when all said and done. Alright, thanks for hanging with me, guys. Keep watching the channel. We'll have more reviews and cool stuff to come.